Hello and welcome. My name is Jordana Gessler, and I am the Vice President of Education and Exhibits at Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you for joining us for our annual Teicholz Holocaust Remembrance Film Series, the only film festival in Los Angeles dedicated to Holocaust films. This annual film series integrates films with panel discussions of renowned historians, filmmakers, and survivors. It is always moderated by noted journalist, author, and son of Holocaust survivors himself, Tom Teicholz. This summer's film series, which focused on documentaries, is supported by the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany. Founded in 1961, Holocaust Museum LA, the first survivor-founded and oldest Holocaust museum in the nation, houses the West Coast's largest collection of Holocaust-era artifacts. We continue our mission to commemorate those who were perished, honor those who survived, educate future generations about the Holocaust, and inspire a more dignified and humane world. We are committed to teaching students and visitors, both on-site and online, the critical lessons of the Holocaust and its continued social relevance through customized tours, artifact-rich exhibits, creative programs, and intergenerational conversations with survivors. Our work is more critical than ever, given the fragile state of today's world. With the war in Ukraine, humanitarian and refugee crises, and the alarming rise in hate crimes and rhetoric in this country. The Center of Study of Hate and Extremism at Cal State San Bernardino recently found that Los Angeles recorded the most hate crimes of any US city this century. A few weeks ago, the California Department of Justice's annual report revealed anti-Jewish hate crimes have risen 32%. Film is a particularly adept medium for seeing interest, increasing knowledge, educating, and raising difficult questions about the Holocaust. Holocaust Museum LA launched this annual Holocaust Remembrance film series in the summer of 2016 through the support of the Teicholz Holocaust Remembrance Film Fund. The fund was established by Tom Teicholz, an award-winning journalist who has written extensively about the Holocaust and Holocaust in film specifically. Both of Tom's parents were Holocaust survivors. His father had been a resistance leader who helped save other Jewish lives after the war, and his mother an actress in Hungary. Thank you so much for joining this evening for the panel discussion on the film One Survivor Remembers, which follows the story of Gerda Weissmann Klein, who was a young Jewish girl when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. Her family was forced to live in the basement of her home before they were separated from one another. One by one, 15-year-old Gerda lost her brother, father, mother, best friends. She was liberated from her, in her words, 6-year nightmare by an American soldier whom she later married. This Oscar-winning film was produced in cooperation with HBO and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In 2012, the film was selected for inclusion in the National Film Registry of the Library of Congress, a registry reserved for films that are culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. We're pleased to welcome our panelists this evening for what I'm sure will be an informative discussion. Carrie Tallis is an Academy Award-winning filmmaker who won the Academy Award for Documentary Short Subject and the Emmy for Outstanding Information Special, which I believe you can see in his upper corner of his screen, for this very film, One Survivor Remembers. As the son of Greek immigrants, this documentary offered him an extraordinarily vivid connection to his own mother's experiences in Nazi-occupied Greece during the Holocaust. Carrie worked as a creative executive at HBO for the better part of 2 decades, overseeing the production and development of numerous award-winning films, miniseries, and documentaries. He currently serves as the Board of Visitors at Georgetown Law and formerly served as the co-chair on the Board of Directors for Young Storytellers, an arts education nonprofit based in Los Angeles. Carrie is currently the publisher and editor at Crime Story. Joining him is Professor Michael Berenbaum, an American scholar, professor, rabbi, and filmmaker who was the co-producer on this very film. He specializes in the study of the Holocaust. He has served as Deputy Director of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, Project Director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Director of that same museum's Holocaust Research Institute, which is where he was when he facilitated Carrie's first meeting with Kurt and Gerda Klein. Michael is currently the director of the Siggy Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University here in Los Angeles. Michael is the author and editor of at least 20 books, scores of scholarly articles, and hundreds, if not thousands, of journalist pieces. He's won the Simon Rockwauer Memorial Award of the American Jewish Press Association 3 times in 3 different categories during a 2-year period. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's program, Tom.
Thank you so much, Jordana. When we talk about having accomplished and distinguished panelists, I think tonight is a great example of that. I am so happy to be joined by Michael, who I've known for a long time, and I am happy to say I once called him boss on the Encyclopedia Judaica. We worked together on that, and I've known Michael these many years, and Carrie is a new friend whose company I enjoy very much. So it's great to be here and to talk about this amazing documentary. Carrie, tell us a little bit about how you came to make this film in the first place.
Well, thank you first for having us, Tom, and for bringing the film to the audience for your festival. It's particularly special this year as Gerda passed away a few months ago, and she's been very much in both Michael's and my thoughts over these last few months. In 1994, I was working at HBO as an executive, what they call a creative executive. And I was working with a woman named Sheila Nevins, programming documentaries for the HBO service. And at that time, Sheila had already developed a reputation as a maverick among creative executives. She would run the gamut of programming, everything from programming about crime to more esoteric films and aspirational films, like the story of a school for gifted children in underserved neighborhoods. We had been talking about 1995 and programming for 1995 as the 50th anniversary of the end of the war and the liberation of the camps. And what we wanted to do was find a film project that would, as we discussed very specifically, bring humanity, bring a sense of love and lives lost to the statistics of 6 million lives lost, to the footage, the dehumanized footage that emerged from the camps. And I felt a very strong kinship to that notion for several reasons. I grew up the son of a Greek immigrant woman whose father was killed by fellow Greeks who were collaborating with the occupying Germans in Greece in the early 40s. Her father was killed suddenly, and that she lived with that trauma for the rest of her life. We were also living in the middle of the conflict in the Balkans and the genocidal behavior, particularly of Bosnian Serbs towards Bosnian Muslims. And all of that echoed in my mind, and I know in Sheila's mind, that we really wanted to try to tell a story to bring to life the experience of the Holocaust. And so we interviewed several people who were making films. None of them sort of fit into the vision that we had. And then separately, on the same weekend, Memorial Day weekend in 1994, we went down to the Holocaust Museum, which had opened just a couple of years earlier, perhaps less than a couple of years earlier. Michael will obviously tell us all about that. And we both came back to New York from DC, and we were, and Sheila was the one that said, of all the stories, that girl with the boots, that girl with the boots. And so we decided to make a film about that, about Gerda, try to make a film about Gerda's story. Before we reached out to Michael, we tried to find a filmmaker to make that film. We interviewed a couple of people. One person passed. The other person wasn't right for it. And then I pitched myself to produce and direct the film. And Sheila, I think, was eager to get rid of me as an executive. And so she slept on it tonight and came back and said yes. And then we reached out to Michael to ask if he could, first of all, lend his support, and secondly, connect us with the Kleins.
Michael, tell us a little bit from your side, and give us some context really about you know, the documentaries about the Holocaust and why this story you know, you wanted to make with HBO.
Let's begin with a very simple thing. First of all, it's wonderful to be with two friends. Tom, you and I have known each other for a long time, and Kerry and I have known each other for 28 years, and we share a mutual love in common and deep and profound admiration for each other, at least on my side for Kerry, and I'll let him talk for himself. Let me give you a little bit of background on it, because Kerry touched on it. We had a problem years ago. How do we conclude a Holocaust museum? How do we discharge people from the Holocaust back onto the National Mall and make them transition between that world and the world that we inhabit day in, day out? We came up with a bunch of lousy suggestions. And finally, a terrible a mediocre New York detective series gave us the secret of what we had to do. And that detective series, some older people on this will remember, was called The Naked City. And the only thing you remember about The Naked City was the last line on The Naked City. There are 8 million people in this city, 8 million stories, and this has been one of them. And we decided the great transition would be if we had fragments of memory told by survivors, because they really transitioned between that world and our world. And we concluded those fragments with this dramatic story of Gerda Weissmann Klein. And we knew the moment we saw it, we knew that putting Gerda in front of the camera, as I kid Kerry, all you had to do is get out of the way and don't screw it up, because she is a magnificent storyteller. And she also does things that if you were directing her to do, you couldn't direct somebody to do that. She's talking about the scene where her father puts his hands on her shoulder, and she puts her hands on her neck, and her neck begins to expand, and you can feel the pressure of that. And then when HBO approached us and said, we want to do it, we said, absolutely. We want to help you. Let's do it, because this is a fabulous story. It's also a transition to an American story. And we learned to deeply and profoundly appreciate the integrity, the depth, and the skill that Kerry and HBO itself brought to this project. And the result is a work that we're profoundly proud of. And both of us, Kerry and I, are deeply proud of it. And it's a very special part of our life. And all the awards afterwards were only the crown, you know, the cherry on top of the whipped cream. We already had the whipped cream. The whipped cream was the movie itself.
Well, and speaking of the movie itself, which I watched it a week ago, and I watched it again this morning, and you know, I was very struck, Kerry, by the filmmaking, by the choices you made, the tremendous dignity that you brought to telling Gerda's story, and the we were just talking about David McCullough, but the David McCullough-like voice narrating, and talk to us a little bit about how you chose to make this movie, tell this story.
Well, the mantra, as Michael suggested, was always get out of the way. Gerda has a gift that was evinced in the testimony film that had probably 80 or 90 voices in it. There were 80 or 90 survivors that gave their voice to a testimony film that was part of the permanent exhibit at the museum. It was the concluding piece of the exhibit at the museum. But Gerda's voice and her ability to relate the lost lives and the lost love that was the Holocaust really cut through. And so we felt like what we needed to do was just try to support that and allow her memories to become the viewer's memories, the viewer's experiences. And in many ways, it makes, as Michael described, what the museum does. There's a part of the museum that's essentially a hall of photographs, where hundreds of photographs are on the walls going up several stories around you. And we wanted to capture that feeling. The other thing that Gerda had going, that was part of Gerda's gift as a young son of an immigrant woman is that she did feel uniquely American. Even though she spoke with an accent, she spoke in an American vernacular. She spoke as if she were speaking to her own children. And there was an emotional accessibility there that was very powerful. So what we did was we went back through the footage that Sandy Bradley, who made the testimony film, had shot of Gerda and Kurt. And we cut that down to about, I would say about 10 minutes, 12 minutes of footage. And then we read One Survivor Remembers. I went to Arizona and I sat with Kurt and Gerda and we spoke for hours and hours. And we figured out what else we wanted. And then we had Sandy Bradley come. We went to Washington, D.C. I think she shot the film the night before Yom Kippur. So we shot the second interview the night before Yom Kippur. So she was feeling the weight of surviving and those memories very profoundly. And we shot a second interview. And what you see in the film is two interviews that were shot essentially 3 or 4 years apart.
Wow.
But what we worked to do was meld them so that it would feel seamless. And I can tell watching the film what's from which interview, but I don't think many other people could tell you what is from which. But I think a clue is she felt the weight of the memories much more profoundly in that second interview. And then what I did was I put together an audio cassette of what I would call Gerda's greatest hits. It was about 30 minutes long of the things that I knew we needed to include in the film. And I went to Poland and the Czech Republic to shoot in the places where she had been. And we found her home, the home that she grew up in, which was essentially a tenement, but we found ways to shoot it so that it would feel like you were there in 1939, 1940. We found each of the places where she was interned. We went to the graves of her friends in Volery in the Czech Republic. And what I hired an excellent director of photography, Andrzej Jeziorek, and our mission was to put ourselves in Gerda's point of view so that we could dissolve in and out of her interview and bring people into her memories and her experience.
Well, it's very, very powerful for doing that.
And Tom, let me add two very short, small things. My advice to all filmmakers on the Holocaust is don't add drama, let the drama come forth. Because the story itself is incredibly dramatic. And the other part of it, the ending, is an unbelievable ending, especially when there's the quote from Goethe. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, you could not have invented that. And Kerry very gently allowed the drama to come forth. And the drama it comes forth in a variety of different ways. Gerda brings it forth. You want a symbol of loss. She speaks about, my mother didn't make the bed for the longest time. She didn't want to lose the indentation of his head. Now, how do you describe loss more magnificently than precisely that void, that emptiness, that indentation? And, you know, I get up in the morning and I look at the indentation of my head and I feel lucky when I come home and put my head back on that very same pillow. The other thing that you'll notice that Kerry did magnificently is that when you see the deportation scene, Kerry did not shoot the street as it exists today. He shot the roof line. And the roof line is the same roof line that she would have seen riding away precisely from her town. And the further she got away, that's the way in which the roof line. So he was meticulous in making sure that the viewer, that the audience came to terms with her world, showing what it was like to live in the basement by seeing the staircase.
Yeah.
And that again becomes enormously powerful scene by seeing a staircase and you're confined to the basement and you really feel what it's like to be confined. And then just let the story come out of her mouth.
Well, to Michael's point, this story does have a surprise twist ending when she is liberated in the camp by Kurt. And were you aware of that already going into the story, Kerry?
I was not aware of it when
When you saw the shoes, you weren't aware of it.
Well, when I saw the testimony film, which that interview is a part of, I was not aware of that story, and so I experienced the magic of that. And
just in case, Kerry, just tell people in case they haven't watched the film yet.
Gerda tells the story of the final days of World War II, and she and her friends who've survived a death march are holed up in an abandoned bicycle factory in what's now the Czech Republic. And these soldiers drive up to the door of the factory. They're American soldiers. She is withered away. Her hair is white. She's 21 years old.
68 pounds.
And she
hasn't had a bath in years.
And the young GI who comes to the door says to her, can you take us to see the other ladies? And she says, we're Jewish, you know. And he says, so am I. And that young man became her husband, the father of her children, and the pathway to her future in the United States.
Yeah, I mean,
And
amazing. Michael, in the
Kurt also has a backstory. Here he
I'm
was.
going to give you the opportunity to tell, but I just want you to talk about this line that you include in the educational material, that we learn from Gerda that not every defeat need be final.
You know, survivors, as you know, Tom, survivors have undergone a tremendous transition in our world. They have gone a transition. When they first came to the United States, they were called Greener, the newest of immigrants. Then they were called immigrants, and there was the perception that everyone had a backstory, and we didn't want to hear it. They, over time, transitioned from being victims to being survivors, and then survivors who also became witnesses. And they've also then transitioned in our world to a symbol of resilience and the ability to live life after death. And that is to face the abyss and to come forward from the abyss. And Gerda had a very interesting career as a speaker. And she spoke in Columbine to the kids and talked about how one comes back in the aftermath of such destruction. We also use it educationally for suicide because she has an incredible line, which suicide is the final solution to a temporary problem. And it's a way in which you can raise that issue with teenagers who are prone to see every defeat as final. And part of what she teaches us is the ability to come back, to develop resistance and resilience. And part of the glory of Kurt's love for her was in that moment, hair white, 21 years of age, 68 pounds, hadn't had a bath in 3 years. He saw her majesty and her beauty. Now, you couldn't make that up. If you made it up, they would throw you out and they would say, you know, couldn't happen. And that's the nature of their relationship. And I want to stress to the people who are listening, there's also a book by Gerda that's now been in print for almost 75 years called All But My Life, which describes what was taken away from her. And it has an afterword now, which is about the life after all but her life was taken away, which is about resilience and comeback and witness and the power of testimony.
One of the greatest gifts that this project has given to me, Tom, and Michael was a very important part of this. Our aspiration was to communicate to future generations the lives and loves lost. And after the film went on HBO and after the film won the Oscar, we were able to, first of all, Don Hewitt, who was running 60 Minutes at the time, called Sheila and asked if he could put the film on 60 Minutes. That gave us an audience of 20 million people. And then the Southern Poverty Law Center, Morris Dees organization in Alabama, made it part of their teaching tolerance program. And they put the film in well over 100,000 schools, and it became a perennial part of the curriculum of all of the, or most of those schools. Michael's lesson plan for a teacher who's teaching a 40-minute class about or a 45-minute class about the Holocaust, and then has a follow-up session, is at the center of that curriculum. And there's nothing that is more gratifying about making this film, beyond the deep impact that it's had on my life, than to know that that film has impacted a generation of people, and that they were guided through that experience through Michael's lesson, with Michael's lesson plan in tow. My own kids had the experience of seeing the film in school with their peers, and Gerda coming to talk to them after it played. That, it gives me chills just to think about being able to give future generations that experience.
And one thing that Kerry did, and if this is a mutual admiration society, it really is. One thing that Kerry did is he told the story in 38 and a half minutes. Now, 38 and a half minutes means that if you have a 50-minute class or a 45-minute class, you still have time for discussion. And believe me, I've seen it in schools all over the world, not only in the United States. And there is nothing the kids can do afterwards but discuss that. But he made it accessible in a way that very few films are quite as accessible. And all we had to do was to give it the tools, because teachers sometimes are afraid of what do you do with this? And we gave them the tools to do with it. But the genius of it being 38 minutes is quite something. For schools, it's an unequal tool.
And the opening is very powerful, the footage that you use, Kerry. And, I almost wondered if the film were being made today, whether they would think that was too, whether you'd get pushback that it's too harsh or graphic to show the bodies the way you do, which I found incredibly powerful.
Well, first of all, we were the first people to see that footage. We had the National Archives develop that footage.
Wow.
Secondly, we benefited from the fact that we were HBO at the time, and we had no network boundaries. We just were guided by our instincts of propriety and resonance. And so, it worked. It worked.
Yeah. Yeah. Kerry, talk a little bit about the impact on you personally.
Well, my mother, as I mentioned, she was traumatized by her experiences during the war, and she also had the experience of one of her brothers going to communist Germany after the war. And she and her siblings, after some very difficult years in Greece, emigrated to America. And so they came to America during the height of McCarthyism with a brother who was a communist in Germany. And so they lived in great fear. They did not speak of what happened in Greece. They were actually, just to go back, they were all American citizens because their parents were American citizens, and my grandfather had emigrated to the United States and then moved back to Greece. Gerda's ability to communicate her memories and the memories and loves and the memories of her loved ones, I found a window to my mother through Gerda.
Mm.
She made me want to be a better person, a better husband, a better father, she and Kurt. And so beyond the impact of the film on my professional career, which has been enormous, more enormous has been the impact that Kurt and Gerda had on me as a human being. I mean, it literally, I thought I wanted to be a filmmaker. I came out of the experience wanting first and foremost to be a father and a husband. And I made choices in my career thereafter that made it easier for me to be those things first and then a professional second. And so that's probably the most profound impact that Gerda and Kurt had on me.
I wanted to bring up the importance of telling the women's stories of the Holocaust. Last week, we had as one of our panelists, John Keane, who made the wonderful documentary Swimming in Auschwitz and the follow-up about the women's lives in America. But, Michael, give us some context, because too often the stories that we heard, at least in the first wave, were the stories of men. And what's so amazing about Gerda is the way she talks about her girlfriends in this.
And there's a gentility and an intimacy and a sharing of feelings that we don't particularly have in male testimony, with the rarest of exceptions. This was a period in Holocaust literature and in Holocaust historiography where people were fighting about the question of women's memory. We've had a period in which they said, no, everybody suffered, and therefore to break out the experience of women is unfaithful to the story, because everybody suffered. They suffered, as it were, equally. And then there were a group of feminist theoreticians who wanted to prove the feminist theory on the basis of what happened in the Holocaust. And this began a period of time in which we understood that men and women had different experiences. Men, women, girls, and boys had different experiences during the Holocaust. Some of them directly related to the fact that they were of a particular gender. And lots of stuff has come out since, and there's been a tremendous amount of literature on this. But there's an intimacy, a wholeness. We made a bet for strawberries and whipped cream after the war. And then Gerda says, I lost that bet. She talks about a beautiful redhead who comes forth and gives an aspirin to her friend. We only have one little picture of Ilse. We couldn't find anything aside from that. So she looks like a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, but she actually was a 17-year-old, an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old during this period of time. And we began to understand dimensions of women's testimony. We now understand a whole range of sexual violation that's not part of this story. We also understand that in resistance, women could do things because they had an easier time passing as non-Jews, since men were circumcised and women were not. And the other is, even in the religious community, the men very often did not have a secular education, so they didn't speak the native language properly to be able to pass, and women could do that. So there's been a whole development of women's literature all the way through since then. And what makes this so marvelously accessible is that she expresses it in all sorts of ways, and there's a vividness that's incredible. I still remember and can quote the line. Carrie can quote the line. Ski boots in June, but in those days one didn't argue with one's father. I had ski boots, and I saw girls wearing sandals and breaking off their toes like twigs. You can feel that.
Yes.
You can experience that, and it becomes so powerfully vivid that that's the nature of Gerda's testimony, and it's the nature of Kerry's skill, and sometimes the greatest skill in filmmaking, is restraint.
Right. Like we said, get out of the way and let Gerda tell her story.
Get out of the way and let her speak to the camera. And what he does is to give just enough to fill it in all sorts of ways. So we see the places, we see the pictures, and Gerda was lucky in one way. She both saved the pictures of her family, and she also had an uncle in Turkey. And one of the things that everybody did in that generation is with every letter, pictures were transmitted in the same way that we put our pictures on Facebook or share them. And there's an entire chronicle that took place. So she had images of the people she had lost, which makes it easier for us to see them, to imagine them, to feel them, and to get a sense of both their presence and their absence.
Yeah. Again, a remarkable person and a remarkable piece of filmmaking. I want to give you each the opportunity to say some concluding words, and then I will wrap up. We've gotten not questions, but great praise for both of you from our viewers of this panel tonight, saying such an incredible film. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Carrie. So I'm going to start with you, Michael, and then give Carrie, as the filmmaker, the last word.
First of all, I have to say what happened last night, which is that my older kids lived through this experience because they were mature, or as mature as they could be in 1995. And my younger kids had not seen this film. And last night, my wife, who's on this show, sort of insisted that my kids see the film, my young kids see the film. And what was intriguing about it is how it grew on them. They first were doing it because mother insisted, and then all of a sudden it became captivating. It made me feel so much how much Gerda is alive, and made me feel her loss incredibly. And I really felt the presence of her absence and the absence of her presence.
Beautiful, Michael.
The last time I saw Gerda was in February of 2020. That was 2020 was the 25th anniversary of the debut of the film. And we went, or I went to Scottsdale, Arizona, where Gerda was living, and we did a screening of the film at the retirement community where she was living. I think we're fortunate that it didn't turn into a super spreader event, because it was 150 people in a room in February, just as the pandemic was coming down on us. And Gerda had said she didn't want to see the film again. She didn't want to participate, but she was urged to help get it going by a guy named Mort Skult, who I have to credit with bringing us all together, because if not for that, I would not have seen Gerda so recently. And it was incredible to be with her in that room and her peers from the community, and have the one last opportunity to be with her and to remember Kurt, remember the experience we had together. The one last thing I'll say is I also remember them Kurt and Gerda coming to visit with us in New Jersey when our own children were just babies. This was 5 years after we made the film and Karen and I had started our family. And I'll just never forget, you know, I say that Kurt and Gerda, we talk about icons in our culture. We talk about pop icons, we talk about sports icons, but Kurt and Gerda were icons in the truest sense of the word, in that they lived lives that we should all emulate and seek to emulate. To me, that's the most impactful thing I feel like I can say about what those two people meant to my life and to the lives of so many millions who have been touched by their presence on film.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been such a richly rewarding discussion that I will take with me. And this summer's series has been very powerful, and tonight more powerful still. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for both of you for making this film, for sharing it with all the people who viewed it to date and all the people who viewed it tonight and in the next few days. I want to thank the audience and community for watching and participating. We have more than 400 people watching now. We've had more than 300 at every film we've shown this summer. Please visit Holocaust Museum LA for a full calendar of their upcoming events. I'm going to thank our sponsors, including the consulate, the German consulate, the Richenthal Foundation, the Davidson Hooker Foundation, the YNS Nazarian Foundation, and the Leo and Rita Greenland Foundation. You can watch these programs on our YouTube channel of the Holocaust Museum, and I look forward to discussing more films with you next summer. Again, thank you all, and good night. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Carrie.
Tom.
Thank you.